Hello everyone and welcome to Examining Simplified Shelf Life Testing Methods. I'm Brad Newbold from Customer Research here at Meter Group. Today we'll have 45 minutes for our presentation, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A with our presenter, Dr. Brady Carter, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. First, we really do want this to be a discussion, so we encourage you to ask any and all questions in the questions pane, and we'll track these for our Q&A session towards the end. Second, if you're wanting us to go back or repeat something you might have missed, no problem. We're recording the webinar and we'll send around a link to the recording via email within the next few days. All right, so let's get started. Today we'll hear from Dr. Brady Carter, Director of Food Science at Meter Group, who will talk about just completed experiments showing how to simplify mode of failure testing and how you can adapt these experiments to do your own in-house shelf life testing. Dr. Carter's been with the company for 13 years, where he oversees development of and provides support for new and current moisture analysis instrumentation. He has a PhD and master's degree in cereal chemistry and crop science from Washington State University and a bachelor's degree in botany from Weber State University. He's been an instructor for numerous water activity seminars and has provided on-site water activity training for companies all around the world. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Carter to get us started.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Hopefully this will be a useful seminar for you where we're going to discuss elements of shelf life, give you some ideas about some ways that you might be able to simplify that process, simplify the approach, simplify the experiments that you might need to do, and simplify the evaluation of those results. So as we go through this, the discussion, I'm going to talk about an actual study case that we took upon ourselves to investigate within our own research lab to try and put these principles into practice. You're going to see that they're mixed results, which isn't surprising and should be expected when you're doing this type of work. But then hopefully I'll be able to show how we're able to still utilize the information to take a look at shelf life. So hopefully that'll be a learning experience for you, just as it's been a learning experience for us. Okay, so start out with what is shelf life? And roughly, if we give a rough translation of or definition for shelf life, it's basically the practical time that a product remains desirable to a customer, where they're still going to want to consume it, still purchase it. So this is obviously going to depend on a lot of different factors: what type of product, what happens to the product, how it's stored, how it's handled. A lot of things go into contributing to shelf life, but basically what we want to find out is how long does the product remain in a form that's acceptable to consumers and they'll actually purchase the product. It can also refer to how long the product has remained safe. Sometimes what ends shelf life can be quality related, sometimes it can be stability related. So we're going to talk about all those factors as we go through our presentation. Oftentimes, a shelf life is used to determine what's called a best by date or a use by date, often put on labels. Interestingly enough, these best by dates are not something that's typically regulated. So there's really no oversight on what's put on a package as the best by date. There are some specific types of products like baby formula that do require some regulation and oversight, but for the most part, there's really nothing that regulates what you can put on as your best by date. Now, obviously, though, from a manufacturing standpoint, you don't want to have a product go bad before that date, where you have to then or are held responsible from the consumer standpoint for your product having gone bad before it was supposed to. And That causes all kinds of problems, may even lead to a recall. So while not regulated, certainly it's something that you don't want to mess up on when you're considering what to put as the best by date for a product. Now, what the actual shelf life is of a product depends on both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So examples of the intrinsic properties are things like water activity, matrix type, what's going on in the product. Is it an amorphous glassy product? Is it a crystalline product? Is it a baked product? Is there gelatinization of starch that occurs? A lot of different things will determine what and how the interactions occur within the matrix will have a big impact on what that shelf life is. And of course, the ingredients that are going in there that contribute to what that matrix is, and what they are in those particular ingredients are most susceptible to in terms of modes of failure. Different types of ingredients will have different modes of failure. In terms of extrinsic factors, we're talking about things like storage humidity and storage temperature being two of the biggest factors that influence shelf life. And of course, those are, especially humidity, are influenced by packaging. Another extrinsic factor is the oxygen content or oxygen availability within the package. That's also controlled by packaging as well. And of course, that depends on what type of product you're working with. So certainly there are things that we need to account for when we start trying to answer the question of what the shelf life of a product is. There are things that we need to consider, and so hopefully we can get some ideas about how to consider those in a very specific way, and in a way that which we might be able to model them. So what is it that will end shelf life? Again, this depends heavily upon the product that you're dealing with, but it may be microbial spoilage. Certainly, if your product is susceptible to microbial growth, and it happens in the product, typically that means that that's the end of that shelf life. Whether that be mold, which is not as dangerous, but still as undesirable from a consumer standpoint. Most people don't want to eat something that's covered in mold unless that's supposed to actually be there, which is the case on some types of products. But even more of more concern in terms of food safety would be the growth of pathogenic bacteria that make the product potentially hazardous. And so certainly the growth of dangerous organisms is going to end the shelf life of a product. But that's only true in very high water activity products where microorganisms can grow at water activities higher than the practical limit of about 0.7. If you're at water activities less than that, it's likely not going to be microbial spoilage that ends shelf life. It probably is going to be something quality related, such as loss of flavor or changes in flavor. This could be the result of browning reactions that can occur, or Maillard browning reactions. It could be that oxidation occurs, lipid oxidation in the product, and leads to rancidity, which gives off flavors and off odors. It could be that your product is a multi-component product and moisture migration is occurring, and that moisture migration is causing problems. Areas to fail that wouldn't fail if they hadn't encountered higher levels of moisture. And so that leads to the end of shelf life. It could be loss of texture. Many, especially low moisture foods, have an expected texture associated with them, and when that texture changes, they become undesirable to the consumer. Could be nutrient loss, especially where you're trying to offer a high nutrient, high vitamin type of a product, and then while your product sits on the shelf, those nutrients deteriorate and are lost, and so that when the consumer actually uses the product, the nutrient content is no longer there and is not delivered to the consumer. So there's lots of things that could end shelf life, and this can be a little bit challenging and overwhelming, especially considering that a lot of people, when they set out to test shelf life, haven't even asked the question of what it is that ends shelf life for the product. And that's pretty much impossible to do. You can't really figure out when shelf life is ended if you don't have any idea what to look for. And so this is a very important step of trying to identify what it is that you're most concerned about with your product. So how do you wade through all these potential modes of failure? Ticking off this list and going down through the list isn't really a valid option. That's going to take a ton of work and a lot of wasted time just figuring out that each one of them may not even be, there isn't any reason to consider them as being a factor for your particular product. So how do most companies determine shelf life? What is the most common way that people will approach this subject? And the first one is guess, and that might seem like a silly answer, but in fact it happens quite a bit, where you essentially, in order to avoid having to spend the time, or you don't have the time to figure it out through experimentation, so you make your best guess. A lot of times that's just based on similar types of products that are on the market. What is their shelf life? And then you try to make a conservative comparison, hoping that you're overly conservative. And in fact, what you do see in most cases is that most products still are good past their best by date, and can go on for several more weeks, or days. But you have to be conservative because you don't know specifically what that shelf life is, and you certainly don't want to have a failure within the best by date on the label. Some people will store the product and actually observe it until it becomes unacceptable. Of course, now when you do this, how do you track what's happening with the product, and how do you test it to be able to figure out when it becomes unacceptable? That could be sensory testing, which is a challenge to do. Most companies aren't set up to do a lot of sensory testing themselves. They're quite expensive and time-consuming. So maybe you could use an instrument or instrumentation to try and to track those modes of failure. But how well do those instruments match up with consumer preference? What is their availability? So there's still challenges with this. And obviously, if your expected shelf life of your product is a year, you're going to have to wait around a long time for your product to fail. And if you're relying on that information to try and make determinations about your product, that's a long time to wait. So what a lot of people will try instead is accelerated shelf life testing, and this is where you subject your samples to elevated conditions for temperature and water activity in order to speed up the processes that can happen. And in doing so, you're able to shorten that shelf life from, say, a year down to a matter of days. And you do that at different conditions, and then model the response at those various water activity temperature conditions, and use that to try and extrapolate back to what would happen under normal conditions. So what is shelf life simplified then? How is that different from those normal approaches or ways of looking at shelf life? What is different about this shelf life simplified concept? Well, what we try to do with the shelf life simplified is to use a step-by-step approach to determine shelf life, so that it's a process that you follow rather than just blindly trying to figure out what to do and what to go after. And so using the step-by-step approach, we eliminate any the most unlikely mode of failures. If there's modes of failure that are just not going to be something that's possible for the product, then there's no sense in pursuing those, at least not until you've eliminated all of the other possible modes of failure. So we're going to zone in or focus in on the most likely modes of failure for the product. And then we'll try and use the simplest method that we can to track the mode of failure, because we're just trying to get an idea of when the product fails. We're not trying to do necessarily to publish our results, so we don't need to try and have the most complete or exact tracking mechanism for the modes of failure. If we can find something that's related to it, correlated to it, that we can more easily track, then that gives us a better option that's not so expensive, like having to use, say, for instance, HPLC instrumentation to try and track vitamin loss. Can we do that using an easier or simpler method that's not so expensive? And then we set up straightforward experiments. And typically we will try to do these accelerated conditions, understanding the challenges and potential pitfalls that can come from accelerated shelf life testing, especially if your accelerated conditions cause the product to change its matrix type, for instance, going from a glassy to a rubbery state. So there are things to consider when using accelerated shelf life testing. And then I'm going to introduce ways that you can use our moisture analysis toolkit. This is a software program that we provide from Meter that can be helpful in being able to take the data that you would collect from a shelf life experiment and then actually do some work with it, try to use it to predict shelf life. Okay, so let's take a look at what the steps to our process are. So in our shelf life simple egg process, first question we ask is, what is the expected water activity of my product at a typical storage temperature? And that may be just a matter of having an initial version of your product that you make up in a test kitchen or in a pilot facility, and then measure its water activity. And you can do that with a simple water activity instrument. We provide lots of those. And then once you know what that water activity is, then the next question is, at that water activity, what is my most likely mode of failure? And as you can see below, we can separate out, based upon particular water activity ranges, we can isolate what are the most likely modes of failure for those water activity ranges. So greater than 0.85, your biggest factor is going to be microbial spoilage. So you have to certainly take that into account, or you're going to likely are going to have to refrigerate your product to try and extend its shelf life. But what's going to most likely end it is going to be microbial spoilage. If you drop down to 0.7 to 0.85, at these little bit lower water activities now, you're still going to be concerned about microbial spoilage because mold can still grow, but also chemical instability could become a problem. This range is the range where many chemical reactions are at their highest rates, such as Browning reactions, hydrolysis reactions, enzymatic reactions, all maximize in this 0.7 to 0.85 range. And so those are likely, maybe even more than microbial spoilage, chemical reaction could be what ends the shelf life of the product. It affects the flavor or the smell of the product. Dropping down to the 0.4 to 0.7 water activity range, now your most likely mode of failure changes over to, it's still chemical instability, could be an issue, but now you may have problems with things like texture, where you're moving from intermediate moisture products that are supposed to be soft and chewy to low moisture products that are typically have a hard texture or a crisp texture. And so the loss of that texture or not having an expected texture could be what ends the shelf life of the product. But it could also be moisture migration. This is where most of the multi-component products exist, like a snack cake, where you've got two different components. If there are different water activities, you have the potential for moisture migration, which may lead to the other issues. The moisture migration may result in chemical instability or texture loss. But in order to be able to hold off those other factors, the main thing is to figure out what's happening with moisture migration. Then we go down to lower water activities at the 0.2 to 0.4 range. Now we're most concerned with texture, or a lot of the this is where a lot of the ingredient powders reside, and so any of those powders could be susceptible to caking and clumping. And so that may become the biggest factor that determines shelf life. If a free-flowing powder product starts to cake and clump, it essentially has ended its shelf life. And then at less than 0.2, you might think that this should be the most stable condition. You get at a very low water activity, remove a lot of the water, and you extend the shelf life of the product. But in fact, at very low water activities, chemical instability again becomes an issue because lipid oxidation in particular increases at very low water activities. And if you've got any fats or lipids present in the product, then it can be highly susceptible to rancidity at very low water activities. Okay, now for the experiment that we conducted, we chose a shortbread cookie to look at in terms of shelf life. And we wanted to be able to determine what, if we could get some information about the shelf life of this type of a product, and identify what we wanted to investigate as the most likely modes of failure for this type of a product. So the expected water activity for this product is typically 0.4 or less, typically around somewhere between 0.3 and 0.4. So moving on to question 2 for this particular product, then we want to know at that water activity, what is the most likely mode of failure? And if we go back to our shelf life simplified diagram at 0.4 to 0.7, we have chemical instability, we have texture changes, and we have moisture migration. Now with this type of a shortbread cookie, it is a homogeneous cookie. There's no ingredients that are added or components that are added to it. It's just a plain shortbread cookie. So moisture migration is not likely to be a big issue, assuming that after the baking process that the moisture, or at least after baking and then sitting for some time, the moisture has distributed itself fairly well. So what we are going to then focus on with this product is going to be chemical stability and texture. So our general experimental design was to, first of all, use the actual product. So we're going to use the actual shortbread cookies. And then we need to hold these cookies at different water activities and temperatures to try and identify the role of water activity and temperature in the stability of the product. And so typically we'll do this at 3 water activities and 3 temperatures so that we have a good representation of both properties. And then while these products sit under these conditions, we're going to try and track the progress of the mode of failure, whether that be from a chemical instability or whether it be from a textural standpoint. So to do that, we're going to try and collect time versus quantity change to determine the rate. And we're going to do that for both texture and for chemical stability. And then we're going to try and model the collected data and try to account for both temperature and water activity in our model. So how will we control the water activity and temperature? This is an example of a storage chamber that we designed and manufactured ourselves with the purpose of being able to easily control water activity and temperature. Now, certainly you could do this with an environmental chamber, but environmental chambers are fairly pricey. And the one disadvantage is that you can only do one temperature and humidity at a time in an environmental chamber. Using this approach, if we place inside of our chamber a A saturated salt slurry, depending on what the salt is, it will control the conditions in there as long as there's an excess of it to a specific relative humidity, in other words, creating a certain water activity for the product. And then we can take these containers and place them inside of an oven and set the temperature of the oven to the temperature that we're interested in. That means at one temperature we can be looking at all of the different water activities by having the separate containers. And we have manufactured a few of these, but we also just use some simple clicking Tupperware type of products will work as well, as long as they have an O-ring on them. We've tested those for the tightness of the seal, and the seal is actually a fairly tight seal. So as an even less expensive alternative to a storage container such as this, you could potentially use a Tupperware. We do modify it slightly by putting an RH sensor inside of it in order for us to be able to track the humidity conditions inside of the chamber to make sure that they're not changing or that the slurry is still effectively controlling the water activity. We can also use this type of container to look at things like oxygen concentration through an oxydot that you see there in the top left corner. The clear lid allows us for potentially doing some tracking of color changes. We even, with these storage containers, we vent it so that we can evacuate air out of the chamber if we wanted and replace it with, say, dry nitrogen or nitrogen air to try and eliminate oxygen. And again, these are small enough that we can fit several of them in an oven to control temperature. So it becomes an easy way to create, or an easier way to be able to create the different environmental conditions that we need to test. Now, before I move on, I do want to show you that we can actually use this to do some effective work. This idea of tracking something like lipid oxidation over time. This is an example that we did on some baby formula where we tracked lipid oxidation, in this case with what's called the T-bar method. We matched up with some methods that have been used in some previous literature. And you can see here, plotted now, we actually get a nice trend with this data of an increasing T-bar value indicating the progress of the oxidation reaction. And you can see there that they separate themselves based upon the conditions that they were subjected to. And if we take a look at the R-squared values for the relationship for most of these conditions, that the linear relationship between time and the T-bar value is a fairly good representation of the data. This would indicate then that this is a first or a zero order model for at least for the T-bar value itself. And so from this information, because we know we have these good linear relationships, if we take the slopes of each of the lines that you see there, that gives us an indication of the rate of the reaction under those conditions. So with those rates, we can then do use our hygrothermal time equation. And so here's the hygrothermal time that I was discussing. So this is derived from a derivation from the Eyring equation, which is a first principles rate equation that's been around for at least a century now, that identifies in his original rate equation that the rate is dependent upon what the rate is under the standard condition multiplied by the exponential of Gibbs free energy divided by the gas constant times temperature. And so if we take the Gibbs free energy portion, we can do a derivation of the Gibbs free energy that actually includes water activity as well as an activation energy. And then if we substitute in that form of the Gibbs free energy back into the original equation, and we substitute the more common R indicator for rate in place of the F, then what we get by plugging in the Gibbs free energy is a new form of the equation where the rate is now dependent upon the rate in the standard condition multiplied by the exponential of this constant B related to molecular volume multiplied by the water activity minus the activation energy divided by the gas constant multiplied by time, or sorry, by temperature. And so now we have a form of a rate equation, or an equation that we can use to determine what the rate is that includes both water activity and temperature as determining factors derived from first principles. So the next step then is to use this model to derive and determine through iteration the best values for our unknown constants. And our unknowns are the R naught value, the B constant, and then our activation energy over the gas constant. And so we can derive those empirically through using modeling software, through using the computer, to come up with an estimation of what the best constants are that do the best job of matching up predicted rate with the actual rates that we determined or measured using our experimental data. So if we do that for our T-bar values that I showed you earlier, we get values for each of our constants through our modeling process. And then if we plot our measured rates to our predicted rates, as you can see, we can get a fairly good relationship as indicated by a very high R squared value. And so that's an indication that, that we're doing a pretty decent job of predicting the rate using our model, our hydrothermal time model. And so we've been able to do this successfully using both existing data in the literature as well as data we've generated for, as I showed, T-bar lipid oxidation, but also aspartame loss. We've looked at lysine loss and also looked at Browning reactions using other methods than the one that we tried, where we were able to successfully model the data and put it into a form where we could do some calculations with it. And so what that ends up allowing us to do is to be able to identify real-time shelf life, where we can plug in a water activity and temperature event and the time that it's spent in there, and then figure out using our model what percentage of loss occurred during that time. Typically with previous shelf life models, you basically were forced to give it a set of conditions, and then it estimates the shelf life under the assumption that the conditions are going to remain the same for the entire time that the product is stored. But in fact, what happens is that those conditions change depending on what the storage conditions are. And so what this allows you to do is actually factor in each of the storage events to determine what your actual shelf life is. And then based on what's happened to the product, you can then make an estimation of what the shelf life remaining would be under certain storage conditions. What's actually more interesting, though, is that you can actually take a product off of the shelf at any point in time, take a measurement on it, such as a T-bar like we talked about, and based on that value and where the endpoint is, figure out exactly how much shelf life you have left given us certain storage conditions and using the hydrothermal time model. So you don't even have to necessarily know its past storage conditions. You can figure out at any point in time, based on taking a measurement of it, exactly how much shelf life would be left. So how would you do this from a practical standpoint? This is where you go to our Moisture Analysis Toolkit software, where we've put in this hydrothermal time shelf life tool, where you enter in experimental data that you've created for your product, again using some sort of method to quantify the progress of the reaction. If you put that information in, it will then calculate the rate for those conditions that you've presented, and then it will use that information to model and identify the constants for the hydrothermal time. And then you can, down at the bottom, you can see calculate shelf life. You give it a set of conditions, water activity, temperature, what its current reactant level can be done actual in values or percent change. hit apply, and then it will tell you how much shelf life you have left. So for the T-bar example, at 0.6 water activity and 25 C, the end value being a T-bar value of 1, we can predict a 211 days of shelf life for that product under those given conditions. Okay, so moving on with our shortbread. If it wasn't, and we weren't able to track the chemical stability, what is it that could then be, what was our other choice for looking at in terms of ending shelf life? And the other thing was texture is what we thought we would be interested in. So we investigated texture through hardness testing with the Perten texture analyzer, but we also did some sensory analysis using a 20-member untrained sensory panel with random sample distribution using a 9-point hedonic scale. And we asked them to rate appearance, aroma, color, flavor, and overall. These are very challenging studies to do, though. These sensory panels are labor-intensive and challenging to be able to pull off. Now, in terms of looking at texture, one of the first things we did on these shortbread cookies was run a DDI isotherm curve using our Aqualab VSA. If you're not familiar with what a DDI curve is, I would encourage you to check out our other videos where we talk about the DDI method and what it can potentially do for you. But basically what we were trying to look for was inflection points in this in the DDI curve. And sure enough, with these shortbread cookies, we're able to identify in about the 0.52 to 5.3 region inflections at several different temperatures, indicating that something had changed in the matrix of these cookies. And our suspicion was that that's where texture starts to change. So then we did texture analysis using the texture analyzer, as I identified earlier, with the samples held at different water activities and temperatures. And what we saw was this expected sigmoidal relationship where texture starts to fall off at a critical water activity. And this has been shown in the literature multiple times. What we were able to find out, though, was the point at which the point where that starts to happen in terms of the loss of the texture properties is right at the point where the critical water activity was from the DDI curve. And so we were able to, using a very simplified approach of running a DDI isotherm, we were able to identify, without even having to do a full-on texture study, exactly the point where the texture started to be lost in terms of crispness for these cookies. And would be an indication of where shelf life is starting to end. And in fact, if we put the sensory data up on here, and this is just showing overall score, but basically what we're seeing is that the scores didn't actually fall below the 5 value where it starts to be deemed as unacceptable until you got to values that were higher than that critical water activity from the DDI curve. Most likely because what's influencing the score more than anything is, again, the texture. And in fact, we didn't even, at higher temperatures, we didn't even dare give the shortbread cookies higher temperature, higher water activities because they just basically would fall apart, and I don't think we'd be able to get the sensory panel to actually even consume them. So with the DDI curve, we were actually, based upon our other data, fairly confident that we could have just used that as an approach to be able to identify where the sensory loss was going to happen with these shortbread cookies. And so that's a great place to start if you are looking at products, low moisture products that have specific textural properties. DDI curve is a great place to start to see if you see an inflection point, and we've been able to do this on lots of different products. It may be the case where you can't, and so then you move on to an actual texture study like we did, using different water activities and humidities and identifying it through a texture analysis, or may even have to move on again to a sensory panel. Going back to our moisture analysis toolkit, there's a couple ways that you can utilize this toolkit. One is to look at where the actual inflection point occurs, and this is most easily done through a second derivative. And so you use the tool to identify what the second derivative curve looks like, and then if you mouse over the peak that is associated with the inflection point, it will tell you where that inflection is happening. So in this case, it was at 0.54 water activity is the critical water activity for this particular product, identified through the DDI curve. So if we go back to our our simplified process. What is our most likely mode of failure? We identified it being most likely texture. Next, we want to identify the ideal water activity range. We've done that through our investigation with the DDI curve and the texture analysis, and our sensory panel, that we want it to be somewhere below 0.5 to be safe. And if we can keep it below 0.5, then our product should maintain its textural properties. So with that in mind, we next need to identify and choose some appropriate packaging in order to be able to keep our product down below that critical value. And so the first step is then to identify is to look at the role of packaging and use the information about the package as part of our process to do some predictions about shelf life. And so when we're talking about packaging, what we're interested in is looking at the package permeability properties, and in this case specifically the moisture permeability properties of the packaging material, so that we can use that to figure out how quickly will the water activity inside of the container change, and what will that change in water activity, what impact will it have on what the product is doing, what is its texture, what is its chemical stability, whatever the case may be. So in the case of our shortbread cookies, we identified the critical water activity for that particular product as being at 0.4. So if we were using this example, we would have used at the critical water activity, we would have put 0.4 or 0.5 in there as our critical water activity, sorry. And then we would have told it what the initial water activity was. We would have told it what the surface area of the packaging is, what the mass of the total sample inside the packaging is, what is the humidity of the air that we're interested in. We then we bring in the isotherm for the product that we would have already ran because we had the DDI curve to identify the inflection point, and then we hit calculate, and it shows us what the shelf life would be given a in this case 1.86 water vapor transmission rate. So you can change those water vapor transmission rates and then look at how long is it going to take before the product's going to get past or to a water activity higher than the critical water activity for shelf life. You can also use these tools. There's other tools for packaging. One where you can give it a certain shelf life that you want to achieve, and then storage conditions that you're interested in, and it will then tell you what does the water vapor transmission rate have to be of the packaging in order to achieve that shelf life, or for your product to be able to be in the package for the amount of time you indicated without its water activity moving above the critical water activity. Okay, so when you have the shelf life information, then what do you do with it? Well, certainly you would use it to look at your best by dates, make sure that whatever you have on them now is acceptable, or could it be overdoing it? Could you actually extend your best by date and be able to sell more of the product? But of course, you want to still be conservative. You want to look at worst case scenarios for abuse conditions when you try to identify what that shelf life may be. But you can do that using the tools that we've introduced and just giving it very extreme storage conditions. Once you've identified, though, an ideal water activity range for your product that's going to maximize its shelf life, beyond just being able to determine what that shelf life is, you now know what water activity you need to process your product to in order to maximize that shelf life. So the whole process is also identifying the ideal water activity range. So, for example, for our shortbread cookie, we wanted it to be below 0.5. So we can track the progress of the processing for that particular cookie and measure the water activity as a routine quality assurance test, and then identify whether or not it's meeting or falling within the acceptable water activity range based upon the investigations we did into how we could maximize the shelf life. So now it becomes a very good process control, a very good release specification where you're running a fast 5-minute test with a water activity meter to be able to identify when the product is going to be at its most stable condition. And that can't be done through moisture content alone. It does require some knowledge about water activity, because water activity is what's directly controlling the loss of the modes of failure. Then you want to package it in an appropriate packaging, and you can use the tools that I've identified to try and identify what that packaging is. Once you know a water vapor transmission rate, then you have an idea of what packaging material you can use, trying to save costs by using the least expensive option that still provides the desired water vapor transmission rate. And then, of course, in all of the cases where you're looking at shelf life, especially if you're doing predicted shelf life, you do want to set aside some product to make sure that your predictions are good. But you can start making some decisions before that when you use these predicted shelf life models. So with that, that's my presentation. Again, as far as the approach, please take the concepts and principles and utilize them for your own benefit. I hope you'll take the Shelf Life Simplified concept and try to use at least aspects of it, that it will simplify your process for trying to investigate shelf life. And as we learn more things about some of these simplified techniques for investigating specific factors associated with shelf life, we'll continue to share those with you into the future. I'm hoping to be able to again, as I said earlier, look into how we can modify our testing processes to see if we can get meaningful information with some of these simplified techniques, like the Celstron microscope and the OxySense. So I hope that you've enjoyed the virtual seminar. We don't have much time for questions. I apologize for that, but there is a little bit of time left. If anybody wants to ask any questions real quick, please put them in the questions tab. Otherwise, if you do have questions and you want to address them directly to me, you can see on the screen my email address. Feel free to drop me an email. I'm happy to discuss in further detail any of these concepts. We also do offer a consulting service, so if you wanted us to come in and help you set up these tests and run them and look at the data, we do offer that as a service. So if you're interested in that, you can just contact me directly. Okay, we do have a question about the software to predict shelf life. Do we sell that? We do. We do sell that product. It also is included with the purchase of our Aqualab VSA instrument that looks at moisture absorption isotherms, and that can be purchased so that you can actually do these investigations like the DDI curves yourself. We also offer an isotherm service so that you can get those curves without necessarily having to buy the instrument, and then we sell this software separately. You can also go and have a free 30-day trial of the software if you're interested. Just drop me an email and I'll send you a link to where you can download that software, and then you can try it out, like I say, for 30 days at no cost. We also do offer the software as part of the consulting service, so if you were to hire us to do some consulting for you, that would include the software. I had another question about suggestions for shelf life determination for meat and meat-based products. And that is a challenging one, especially for fresh meat. Certainly for dried meat, there are some of these aspects can be used when you're trying to look at, say, texture as an issue, or oxidation as an issue, or even microbial growth. Now, microbial growth, if you want to model microbial growth, it's a little bit different process, but basically the same concepts of subjecting it to different conditions and then creating empirical models to look at those impacts on the microbial growth. But in terms of lower moisture meat products, certainly the concepts here could be applied. Okay. So there was a question about how do you use the DDI curve and the second derivative to pinpoint the water activity. And as with any approach, you do want to actually use your visualization of the data as well as the second derivative. And so basically what you're doing is combining your visualization of the area where you think the inflection is happening, and then you go to the second derivative. And if you mouse over the peak point in that second derivative, it will just show you the water activity. That's at least an effective estimation of where the critical water activity will be. So that's the most common way that we would use that second derivative to try and identify the inflection point. There's also a question about the software, if there's other equations that we utilize, and yes, there are. Within those tools, you'll also see some equations that can be used to look at the impact of temperature on water activity, so that you can factor that in in your other equations for figuring out what the water activity may be. There's also a model in there you can use to predict the water activity of a recipe, not the moisture migration, but an actual recipe where you're combining ingredients, or you can use it to estimate the amount of solute to add in order to change the water activity. There's also a tool in there for moisture migration where you can predict what the equilibrium water activity will be after you experience moisture migration. So there are other tools as well within the toolkit itself. There was a question about on the software that there are some applications missing. I hope to be able to provide some of those additional ones. We're in the final stages of the chemical stability tool. I showed that in the presentation. You won't see that in the software yet because we haven't released that update, but we're in the last stages of getting that fixed and ready to roll out. So you should be seeing an update available with those with that additional tool, I would expect within the next month. As far as the other two tools, the kinetics and the surface area, we haven't started work on those tools yet. It's still part of what we expect to do, but we haven't, like I say, haven't begun development on those yet. There was one question about can we use the models to look at variability of microbial culture. Not necessarily directly can you use the hydrothermal time model, mostly because there's some other factors that typically you have to include in microbial, looking at microbial growth, like pH and nutrient availability and preservative presence, and a lot of times they end up being specific to humectant type that you use to control water activity. So there are some other factors. If you go to our 201 video that we have archived, I do talk about microbial modeling in there and even give you a reference that you might be able to use to get some more information about that if you're interested. One question about publications of the method of the hydrothermal time or the shelf life simplified. So the shelf life simplified is not published anywhere. It's available in terms of information on it from our website at metergroup.com, as well as in several, we do have other virtual seminars that were specifically on the shelf life simplified process that you can review or look at as well. The hydrothermal time model that I introduced, actually I will be presenting at the shelf life meetings that are happening in Bangkok in November. So that will be the first time that those will actually be published as part of the proceedings for that conference. So I think that's all of our time. Again, if you have additional questions, please direct those specifically to me. I am happy to share PDFs of the slides if you're interested, but also, as indicated earlier on, there will be a recording of this that will become available through our website. So I would encourage you to go there and review it if you so desire. And with that, I thank you for your attendance today, and I hope again that it was helpful to you. And I hope you all have a great day. Thanks.